Welcome to Podcast Answers, the show where I help you start and grow your podcast, answering any podcasting questions that you may have along the way. Guys, we're talking this week about a little bit about marketing, what you can do to market your podcast, and just some ways to get out there and share your content, help people find your podcast. And so we are going to be talking about that right now. But if you didn't know, we do this episode live every Thursday. As I record this podcast, I am live online. I am live, and I'm recording both video and audio live. You can go to podcastanswers.com/live, and that will take you to our YouTube show where we have the live episode going out all the time that we're recording. And then if you want to listen on the go, listen when you're out gardening or whatever you're doing on Thursday afternoons at 12 Eastern, you can use a new podcast app, and that can be found at newpodcastapps.com. A lot of these new podcast apps support live audio streaming, and I am doing that right now. We are on the air, streaming our audio out live to you as well as our video. So if you've not checked it out, go to podcastanswers.com/live, and you can hear us and watch us record live. So, podcast marketing. What are some things that we can do to market our podcast to get a larger audience? So the very first thing that I can think of is knowing your audience well and know what they like, what they don't like, what are their favorite things, what makes them tick, who is your ideal audience for your show. And for me, for this show, that's podcasters, people who are already podcasting, people who want to start podcasting, but don't necessarily know how. So those are two people groups for me for this podcast that my ideal listener is people who already have a podcast, people who are going to start a podcast, but don't know where to start. So for me, the content that I create is going to apply to those people. I'm going to have episodes that are maybe very, very, very basic, as in like how to hit record on your recorder, how to compress your audio to sound good, how to do those basic things that require when you start a podcast. But I'm also going to produce content that is more advanced, like live streaming your episode, like how to do that, how to get into one of the new podcast apps, how to stream video on your show, how to do things like that. So for me, that's my ideal audience, and I want to know them well, and I want to create content that they're going to want to share. So if I create content that applies to them and applies to what's happening in their lives, they're more likely going to share that on their own socials. They're going to say, hey, check out this podcast that I found, Podcast Answers. It's talking all about podcasting, and I want to start this podcast. Because more than likely, they have people who are kind of in the same boat on their social. And so they're willing to share your content with their friends, which will allow you to get more reach and make it organically. Make it so that reach is something that people just want to share. If people like something, they're going to share it. And so create engaging content by knowing your audience really, really, really well. Now, the second thing that I would say is you could use a feed drop. And what a feed drop is when I put an episode in my feed from somebody else's podcast. So it's something that I necessarily did not create, but it is something that is created, but it gives people that are in my feed access to another podcast. So for this, you could do something like interview somebody that has a podcast that's in the same similar niche as you. So for me, I would interview another person who talks about podcasting on their podcast. And again, these are not competitors necessarily. There are people maybe in the same niche, but they're people doing similar things, but they have their own podcast. And what you can do is interview them on your show, but then ask them to put that into their feed. And now I wouldn't just straight drop it into the feed, because if you just straight drop a podcast into another feed, the listeners are going to be like, hey, what is this? I'm not expecting this other podcast host. But what I would do is I would say, let's say I interviewed, or somebody interviewed me for their show. I would take their audio and I would record an intro to it. I would say, like, hey, you're listening to Podcast Answers, and for this episode, I was interviewed on XYZ podcast, and I really think it's a great episode, and you might like it too. So here is that episode right now. And that way it gives you an introduction to your guests about or to your listeners, what's going to happen. But what that does is it allows your listeners to kind of get to know that other podcast. So if you can interview somebody for your show and ask them to put it in their feed, that's going to increase your listenerships. It's going to introduce people to that, as well as you can do a feed swap, like a promo swap. So if you have somebody that's in the same niche as you can go ahead and record a promotion, say, hey, I'm Andy, I'm the host of Podcast Answers, and I do a weekly show all about podcasting where I help you start and grow your podcast, answering any podcast questions along the way. I would love to have you come and hang out with us, blah, 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 and give them the details. You can do that and swap. So you take your promo and give it to another podcaster in the same niche. They give you theirs. You can run their promo. It's a free way to get exposure, but it allows you to exposure to their audience and their to yours. And a lot of times, especially if you're in the same boat, in the same niche, the audience is going to be the same. It's going to be people who are both, interested in both. Now, another way that you could get your podcast out there is using paid advertisement. So the great thing is Facebook ads is fairly cheap, and you can get very, very, very targeting your listeners. You can say, I want to have this advertisement go out to people who like podcasting, or who are this age range and they live in Chicago and they like podcasting. You can very, very niche down your advertisement to specific listeners, and then you can lead to loyal listeners who are going to like and review your show and listen and tell their friends, because they are interested in the kind of things that you're already doing on your podcast. So that's really great, because again, if I talked about knowing your audience well, and they're going to organically share your show, and that's true, but not everybody on their socials are going to be interested in the same things you're listening to. So for me, like if I share that I have this podcast on my socials, 25% of my friends on Facebook are going to be interested in podcasting, maybe 25%. But if I target people on Facebook or the similar socials, I can bring that down to people who specifically like podcasting, who are specifically interested in starting a podcast. So your reach goes a lot farther when you know that you're going to reach people who are specifically interested in the things that you are interested in. Now, you could also use some things like Spotify ads, Podcast Addict, or Overcast ads, things that are in podcast apps. Those are specific podcast apps. You could try paying for those. You don't necessarily have the same level of focused campaign that you would with a paid ad from Facebook or Instagram or wherever. But again, people that are there are already listening to podcasts. So for me, that might be a good thing, because we're talking about podcasting. You can also just tell everybody personally. So I had this all in caps in my notes. Tell everybody about your podcast. Tell your contacts personally. Yes, a Facebook page works, but more than likely people are going to remember if you personally are inviting them. So getting your haircut, tell your barber about your podcast. Talk to them about what you do. Talk to them about how you can help them with, or even if it doesn't necessarily apply to them, tell them, say, hey, I have this podcast about XYZ. I invite you to listen. and get them to be able to get to your show right away so that they can listen and maybe tell others, especially, but invite everybody about that. Going to get groceries, hear somebody talking about your topic, tell them about your podcast. Tell them about your podcast. Tell them about your podcast. I can't repeat that enough, but everybody, tell everybody you know about your podcast. That way it's top of their mind when when they're thinking about things like that. And along with that, I would say create business cards, because the great thing about this is if you are creating business cards for your show, for one, they're fairly cheap to do, but it's that physical stuff that they're going to have in their hand, that they're going to have information. So if you're telling everybody about your podcast, you go to your barbershop, sure, you could say, hey, pull out your phone and go to XYZ or Podcast Answers or whatever, and there I have a podcast. But if you have something like a business card where you can hand that to them, it quickly explains what your show's about and what they can expect from your show, and then has a link and a QR code that takes them directly to your podcast. Now, this is a bonus if you can have a link that takes them to the correct app based on what device they are on. So, for instance, I do this for this show. If you go to podcastanswers.com/listen, easy for me to say, podcastanswers.com/listen, you'll see an example of this. On that page, I'm detecting if you're on an Android device or if you're on a Macintosh or an Apple, and it takes you to a different app. It'll take you to the webpage for Apple Podcasts if you're on an Apple device. If you're on an Android device, it takes you to the page for Google Podcasts, because I don't want to take them to Google Podcasts if they're on Android, or if they're on an Android, I don't want to take them to Apple Podcasts because that app doesn't even exist for them. So if you can have a app or a link that takes you to the correct app based on your device, like podcastanswers.com/listen, that's a bonus tip for you, because that will get them right to the app that they need for their device that they are on. You can also ask your guests to tell their audience about your show. So if you have a guest on your show, you can say, hey, this episode is going to drop on Thursday, and I would really appreciate it if you could just share on your social media about this so that your listeners can go to it, because, or your followers can go to it because they may like it too. Especially like if you have a large following, people are going to be interested that you were interviewed on a show. So the great thing about that is you can give them nice graphics that they can use to post on their shows, on their socials too, and an easy link right to their episode. So for instance, if you had, you don't want to say podcastanswers.com/this-is-a-link to-my-episode. That's hard for them to say. But if you can say podcastanswers.com/John Smith will take you to my episode, then that's going to be really easy to share with their audience, really easy to remember. And then if you've already created graphics that have your branding in it, your colors, your logo, that's going to be a great thing for them. It's going to be easy for them to get that out, to want to share, because you've made it super, super, super easy for them to tell. Now, another thing is you can start an email newsletter. And I know you're thinking, I already get so many emails. Why would I want to start an email newsletter and just bombard people in their email with my content? But the great thing about that is you own all of those listeners. You have their email addresses. Let's just say for some reason you 100% lost your podcast. It went away because your podcast host decided to pull you because of a controversial topic or whatever. You can send an email out to all of the listeners that you know, because you have their emails, and say, hey, this is my new home. This is where you can go to find me. Or, sorry, there's not going to be an episode this week because of a family emergency. The other thing you can do is email every time you post an episode. Don't just limit this, though, to new episodes, but post other thoughts and ideas that are on the same topic space as your podcast. Because people, if you're just posting when you have a new episode out, there's no value add for that, because people can subscribe to you in their podcast app And as soon as you publish an episode, it comes into their podcast app because that's what podcasting is. But if you post that as well as other content, other value add, people are going to be likely to subscribe to your show and your email newsletter. And this is a good way because it's easy to share emails too. So think about it. If I get an email in my email box saying, there's this great new application, I might forward that on to my wife because she might like it too. You can do the same thing when you publish a new episode. Now, the last tip that I have for you today is create social proof by asking your listeners to rate and review your podcast on their listening app of choice. Now, this does not directly, quote unquote, get you in front of more people, as lots of podcasters proclaim that it does. I've heard this many times. Hey guys, go rate and review my show because it helps us get in front of more people. It does not. Apple has said this does not actually help get in front of more people. But what it does do is it helps people look and see how many good ratings and reviews that you have. It's called social proof. People are more likely to check out your show versus one that has no ratings or reviews, no stars, no reviews. Even if there may be some bad reviews mixed in there, there's still reviews. Think about it. If you're going to go to Amazon and you are going to be asking for or going to buy something on Amazon, which thing are you most likely going to buy? The thing that has 0 reviews, 0 stars, or the thing that has 50 reviews, 50 stars? It's social proof. You're going to be more likely to buy the thing that you know that other people have experienced, other people have liked, even if it's not 100% rating, even if it's not 5 stars all the way across the board. You're more likely to go to the item that has 3.5, 4 stars than you are something that has 0 stars. Think about it. So you can ask your people to like, rate, and review your podcast, and that will help create social proof. So these are just some of the ways that you can create social proof about your podcast. These are some of the ways that you can create marketing tactics for your show and help get people out there to listen to your show. Because ultimately, that's what you want, guys. You want people to listen to your show. So get out there, do these tips. If you have questions about podcasting that you'd like me to ask, podcastanswers.com/contact will get you to where you can send me a contact form where I can answer your question. I also work one-on-one with podcasters for editing, starting their show, producing their show, and helping it. So go check it out.